Kenjaku would have then consumed Mahito, absorbing him through curse spirit manipulation as he said, "I must admit, Itadori Yuji, you are a marvelous experiment. You and Mahito pushed each other to heights I wasn't expecting. If I had to battle against Mahito as he was, it would have been quite the risk for me." Jogo was standing on guard as well, as Kenjaku had summoned him in order to use him as backup. And while Choso and Yuji didn't need any more confirmation, this confirmed it in certainty for the both of them, that the one standing in front of them was their creator, as both Choso and Yuji said, "Noritoshi Kamo," at the same time, which caused a bit of confusion to rise on Nobara and Todo's expression for a moment, before Todo then connected the dots. Noritoshi Kamo was the one who made the death paintings. The confusion faded, being replaced with focus, as all four of them knew they were in front of a special grade sorcerer threat, that they would need to do everything they could to defeat him right here and now, and especially not let him use Mahito. And while Kenjaku did want to continue talking, he could tell that both Yuji and Choso were getting ready to fight, as well as everybody else. Both Choso and Yuji clapped their hands together, firing a piercing blood immediately at Kenjaku as a rage began to fill both Choso and Yuji, as they both had hate for Kenjaku and what he had done. In Choso's case, it was because of what Kenjaku had done to his mother, and what he had done to make their brothers. Furthermore, he also knew it was because Kenjaku was planning to turn Choso against his brother. Of course he was going to fail, but he still hated him for even attempting to do something like that. For Yuji it was the same, but there were some additional reasons as well. After all, Yuji did partially blame Kenjaku for Mahito's actions. Kenjaku was the one who set up this entire plan. Kenjaku was the one who set up this battle to happen, which caused so much death, which made Kenjaku partially responsible. Now, he still put most of the blame on Mahito, but he still felt Kenjaku was responsible. But most of all, he also hated Kenjaku for sealing away Gojo. All the death that happened today was because of Kenjaku and his plans. Whatever Kenjaku's twisted goal was, he deserved death, and that was something that both of them were certain of. As out from both Kenjaku's sleeves, several curse spirits began to rise out, most of them being grade 2 to 3 level curses. However, there were tens of them. Todo was about to clap, but suddenly he fell over on the ground, as Kenjaku had activated the Catfish Curse Spirit in order to interrupt his curse technique. At the same time, he used the Curse Spirit Wall in order to delay both of the piercing bloods being fired towards him, using that to his advantage in order to move out of the way of the piercing bloods. This was when Nobara began her own assault, attempting to take advantage of this chance, as the moment she saw Kenjaku move out of the Curse Spirit cover, she threw one of her nails up, focusing a great deal of curse energy into it and slamming her hammer into it, sending that nail flying right at Kenjaku. But as it was being sent flying towards Kenjaku, something else intercepted the nail before it could reach him. That was a small dragonfly. Or at least it looked like a dragonfly, but in reality it was one of Jogo's ember insects. As the dragonfly exploded, causing a large burst of lava to rise out and melting that nail completely down. Everyone had been extremely focused on Kenjaku, allowing Jogo to do some of his own preps. Of course, this was by Kenjaku's own orders, but it still was something that Jogo was able to do, as Jogo had made his way high up into the air while lifting up both of his hands, before he began to rapid-fire bursts of lava down towards his four opponents. Each of these bursts of lava were around the same size as Jogo himself. Jogo was taking advantage of the fact that their focus was on Kenjaku, using this in order to make an opening for his attacks. The whole thought entered into Yuji, Todo, as well as Choso's heads. After all, they had all battled against Jogo. They were the one who put Jogo in such a weakened state that Kenjaku was able to absorb them, so they knew that Jogo was able to make these bursts of fire bigger, which they were all questioning why. Why weren't they making much bigger bursts of fire right now? However, unknown to them, the reason was because Kenjaku didn't want to kill any of these sorcerers. After all four of them had managed to evolve through Shibuya. Even Choso, although Choso didn't evolve as much as he wanted, which did somewhat disappoint him. So we wanted to see how far they would be pushed through the Culling Games. How strong would they get through evolving in the Culling Games, as well as the other sorcerers as well. They had all managed to get much stronger, and in an event like the Culling Games, they were only going to evolve and blossom into much stronger sorcerers than they were even now. Especially his own son, Yuji Itadori, considering the growth that Yuji had shown off in his battle against Mahito. Choso, Nobara, and Todo were forced to move backwards in order to make some more range and distance between themselves, as well as the burst of fire coming towards them. But Yuji instead used a blood explosion underneath himself to launch himself at Jogo. In truth, a small part of Yuji did feel bad. After all, because of the fact that he didn't properly kill Jogo, he was able to be manipulated and used like this against his own will by Kenjaku. He was a bit more empathetic towards Jogo. After all, Jogo wasn't anywhere near as bad as a curse in comparison to Mahito, but he did also know that he had to put Jogo down, and he was going to do so, in order to make up for the fact that he didn't properly kill him before. As Yuji then focused curse energy around his fist, this time Yuji wasn't going to miss. This time Yuji was going to finish off Jogo once and for all, especially after the strength he had gained from his battle against Mahito. He already knew he could win against Jogo so long as he made sure Jogo didn't use his domain, as Jogo then clapped his hands together, firing a large beam of lava at Yuji. However, that was when the blood wings reformed on his back, to allow him to fly around the lava beam while keeping his momentum. As he flew around Jogo, setting himself up to land a hard punch on his back. As he began to increase his heartbeat, planning to use the flowing red scale burst in order to try and finish off Jogo with this hit. However, a pillar of cursed spirits ended up rising in between them that got completely ripped through by Yuji's punch, but also gave Jogo enough time to make sure he didn't get hit by the blow. After all, Kenjaku was still also focused on Yuji, as Yuji was the only person he actually considered a threat right now. Todo was annoying because of his battle intelligence as well as his insanity. It was something that Kenjaku definitely respected about the sorcerer, but it wasn't enough for him to call him a threat. Nobara was someone he would have to be cautious about because of the fact that these nails could be scattered everywhere, but he still didn't consider Nobara strong enough to be a threat yet. And Kenjaku simply considered Choso to be an irritation. After all, he was just a massively inferior version of Yuji. Where while Choso was certainly strong in his own right, in comparison to Yuji he was a lot less impressive. Even with that though, he was still sensing all four of their curse energies nonetheless, making sure that he was keeping eyes on them, but his primary focus and concern was Yuji. However, it was almost like Choso could feel the fact that he was being underestimated, that he was being looked over like he was nothing, which in a way insulted him even more. After all, he felt an immense amount of hatred and desire to kill Kenjaku, and yet Kenjaku was just ignoring him. As Choso then moved both of his hands onto the ground, sending a large deal of blood into the ground. As a large pillar of the ground was launched out underneath Kenjaku, Choso's own blood launching a large amount of the ground up into the air, with the intention of drastically reducing the amount of area that Kenjaku could move in. As Kenjaku did have a slightly intrigued look on his face at what they were doing before it was replaced with that normal confident grin that was present on him all the time. At the same time, Todo saw his own chance for an opening as he clapped, swapping with one of the cursed spirits in the pillar that was used in order to defend Jogo, swapping that cursed spirit with Nobara. Before the cursed spirit could realize what was going on, Todo kicked it and killed it in one shot, as Nobara jumped high off of the cursed spirit pillar while taking out several of her nails. As Nobara began to rapidly smack several of her nails, sending them down towards Kenjaku at a rapid pace. At the same time as well, since Yuji was already still there, he did send out some blood underneath Nobara in order to give her a platform to stand on so she could continue sending out nails towards it without needing to worry about falling. And while Jogo did attempt to try and rush at Nobara in an attempt to interrupt what Nobara was doing, Yuji closed the distance and punched Jogo hard in the face, launching them completely away from Nobara. And as Jogo was being launched, he suddenly felt three things on him, those three things being supernovas from Yuji. Yuji had managed to sneak 3 supernovas onto his fist in that punch, before all 3 of them exploded, launching Jogo into the ground and making a crater where Jogo landed. Kenjaku, seeing that Jogo was definitely going to be in a weaker state as a result of those attacks, chose to unsummon Jogo. After all, he knew Jogo was a bit lacking in durability, and he didn't really want to risk losing him that fast. He still had other cursed spirits he could use if he wanted to. Before Kenjaku's focus then returned to the blood pillar that he was currently on. Considering how much blood was needed in order to launch up that pillar, this was certainly not a good thing for him to remain standing on, as he summoned a cursed spirit that looked similar to a stingray in order for him to fly off of the pillar from. And he got off of it right on time as he saw the pillar completely collapse before the blood got launched high up into the air, before the blood suddenly began to split and change into tens of arrows that Choso was manipulating as he threw his hands down, sending all of those arrows down towards Kenjaku's direction as he was gliding around each of them, sensing each of the arrows that were coming at him. But then as he was flying, because he was only focused on what was coming above him, something grazed past his cheek. He was just barely able to notice it on time, but it still managed to land a cut on his cheek, which was a nail. Nobara had managed to launch out a nail and cut Kenjaku's cheek. As Kenjaku blinked, tapping his cheek for a moment and feeling a slight amount of blood before the wound healed, as he couldn't help but smile a bit wider, as he looked towards Nobara's direction before beginning to speak. As he then said, "Not bad, Kugisaki. Certainly worthy of being considered a first grade to be able to land a hit on someone like me." And while it did sound somewhat sarcastic, it actually wasn't. This was Kenjaku's natural tone of voice. And he was certainly impressed that someone on a grade 1 level of sorcerer was actually able to hit him, as he had to admit that Gojo's dream might have had a little bit more merit than he gave it credit for originally. Now granted, the damage was negligible and it didn't actually do anything lethal, but the fact they could do anything at all was still impressive. However, Nobara wasn't quite done yet, as she sent out a second nail that ended up going through the cursed spirit's wing. This is when Todo saw his chance, as Kenjaku heard 2 claps, as the nail that had went through the wing of the cursed spirit was replaced with Choso. However, the nail that had landed a cut on Kenjaku's cheek was replaced with Yuji. As curse energy flowed around Yuji's fist, while at the same time the sound of his heartbeat could be heard, he was about to use the flowing red scale burst on Kenjaku at such a close range. At the same time, Choso clapped his hands together in order to use a piercing blood and fire it off at Kenjaku. Kenjaku had to admit this was most certainly a brilliant tactic from the four of them. He was impressed that the two of them could work that well together, as he entirely focused on Yuji in that moment, focusing curse energy towards his arm and lifting them up in order to block Yuji's punch, while at the same time the piercing blood went right through his side. The combination of both attacks ended up sending Kenjaku flying as he was sent tumbling to the ground. As Yuji, Choso, and Nobara all landed next to Todo, as they all looked towards the dust where Kenjaku had landed as Kenjaku stood up. He had healed off the wound to his side while he said, "Smart, smart. Using a combination of your abilities to land a hit on me like that, you all have improved quite a bit through your battles, so for that I give you props." He did also have to admit that he was happy he went for blocking Yuji's blow rather than focusing on Choso's blow. After all, his arm still ended up getting broken from having to block a blow like that from Yuji. He was still able to heal it, but it still did some damage to him nonetheless. And if that punch did properly land on him, that would cause quite a great deal of damage, which Kenjaku definitely wanted to avoid as much as possible. Kenjaku decided he was going to take things up a notch, as what looked like several small portals began to open, and out from them were several cursed spirits, each of them being on the level of a grade 1 sorcerer. And there was a total of 3 of them that Kenjaku had just manifested, one of them looking like an electric eel, one looked like a large bear that was twice the size of Kenjaku, and one looked like a rusted knight. With Kenjaku knowing how much stronger his son had ended up becoming, and by extension everybody else, Kenjaku went out of his way to collect some additional stronger cursed spirits in case he needed to enter into combat. As Kenjaku then thought to himself, I just need a little bit more time to stall, and the prison one will finally be complete and I can start the culling games. Now this was definitely much more worrying for all 3 of them. After all, it took quite a bit of effort in order for them to just land this damage on Kenjaku. Furthermore, Nobara, Todo, and especially Yuji were a bit drained on stamina, because while Nobara and Todo did have some time to rest, Yuji did not after his battle against Mahito. Choso was the only one who had fully recovered so far from their battle against Jogo, considering he was mainly just focusing on getting the others out of here rather than actually joining in any fights. Well, of course, other than Kenjaku himself, who Kenjaku, on the other hand, was completely fresh stamina-wise, and now he had released even more powerful cursed spirits to aid him. The one saving grace they had right now was that Kenjaku seemed to be fighting more defensively and not attempting to kill any of them right now. The electric eel curse would have been the one to make the first move, as it smacked its tail against the ground. Then a large wave of electricity was sent right towards the group, one that was expanding in width the longer it went. As a result of that, the 4 were able to figure out quite fast how this cursed spirit worked. Figuring out the electric eel was primarily made to be a long-range combatant, but they also knew that the longer it stayed around, the more and more annoying it was going to become, so they would need to eliminate that curse as fast as possible. As Yuji and Choso nodded to each other, releasing a large wave of blood around the group of 4 in order to shield themselves from this electricity attack. Blood was a rather good conductor, which made it good for countering against lightning abilities, allowing them to send the electricity towards the ground through the blood. Todo was right now trying to think on the cursed spirit's techniques, break them down in order to figure out how to use them against Kenjaku. Choso and Yuji then deactivated the blood orb, and they saw the electric eel didn't smack its tail against the ground again, which told them that it did likely have some type of cooldown, or else it would be constantly smacking its tail against the ground in order to send out lightning attacks. However, they also noticed that the bear cursed spirit was now running towards them, and with each step it took, it made the ground quake underneath it. With each step it took, it ended up cracking the ground, showing the group that this bear definitely had a large amount of physical force. At the same time, the Night Cursed Spirit had also jumped high into the air, as it was now rocketing down towards Choso and sliced at his arm. Choso was quick to use blood armor in order to block the slice, as the Rusted Knight and Choso both stared each other down, while the Bear Cursed Spirit rushed towards Yuji and Todo, attempting to tackle the both of them, but Yuji was able to punch the bear before it could reach them, sending it flying backwards. However, as it was sent flying backwards, several cursed centipedes ended up flying towards Yuji. At the same time, the electric eel then smacked its tail against the ground again, sending lightning into the centipedes this time in order to amplify their speed that they were rushing towards him at. As they ended up sending Yuji flying backwards, delivering several shocks to his body in the process, stunning him for a little bit. However, Nobara, seeing an opening, she jumped high into the air and launched out several nails towards the electric eel cursed spirit's direction, aiming to try and take it down while it smacked its tail against the ground, using this as an opening to try and kill it. But as the nails were rocketing towards it, suddenly a massive cursed spirit that looked a lot like a serpent got in the way of it, taking the blow as it stared towards Nobara. It was a black cursed spirit with what looked like several red cracks all across its body, and it did give Yuji a slight flashback, as it reminded him of the cursed spirit that originally attacked his high school before all of this began, that he met Megumi and fought alongside him against. As Yuji then activated Supernova, destroying several of the cursed centipedes around him and freeing himself from their grasp, and in that moment something else clicked for Yuji, that Kenjaku was behind him consuming a finger, and that Kenjaku was the one who manipulated everything to happen even back then. As Kenjaku then sent Yuji a little knowing smirk, almost as if to confirm that Yuji's suspicion was entirely right. As free moths that were each the same size as Nobara began to fly at her, all of them rocketing towards her at rather fast speeds. As Nobara was able to smack the first one of them with her hammer, sending it flying into the ground, however it didn't die from that strike, as the other two ended up hitting Nobara, causing some damage to her and sending her back into the ground as well. The bear cursed spirit was about to rush at Todo to attempt to slash at him when Todo clapped his hands, swapping places with one of the moth cursed spirits and making the bear slice right through the moth and kill it, as Todo landed next to Nobara and then both of them synced up their attacks, landing an attack on the final moth cursed spirit and killing it in one shot. Or at least they thought that it was the final moth, but suddenly Todo and Nobara saw a wave of moths coming towards them, as Kenjaku has absorbed a lot more than just 3. Meanwhile, Choso parried away the blade of the Rusty Knight, as he was about to try and use Slicing Exorcism to slice at the Cursed Spirit, but before he could even get the chance, another wave of weaker and Cursed Spirits slammed into Choso's body, hitting him into a wall. And once Choso looked up, he not just saw the Rusted Knight was still there, but there were also tens of humanoid cursed spirits that were standing next to their Rusted Knight. These were all rather weak in comparison to the Rusted Knight, but at the same time there were so many of them, and they were going to fight alongside it as well, which is going to make it even more difficult to be able to handle, considering there were so many opponents. As Yuji was now facing off against the Serpent Cursed Spirit, as it decided to rush at Yuji while letting the moths deal with Nobara and Todo. At the same time, the bear was also rushing towards him as well in order to offer some support to that cursed spirit. The 4 of them were all now truly experiencing the horror that was cursed spirit manipulation. After all, it was able to give Kenjaku a near limitless amount of cursed spirits he could add to his arsenal, but more than that, it could potentially give him a near limitless access to cursed techniques. Furthermore, it also allowed Kenjaku to use several at the same time, as he was using it through the vessels of several cursed spirits rather than just himself. Most of all, he could synchronize these cursed spirits up with each other. Even cursings that would seem weak on the surface when used right would be quite a massive threat to anybody. This was something that the group knew well. After all, they had used a similar tactic in order to battle against Jogo and deal with him with no casualties and no injuries. And now they were facing off against a sorcerer that had a much grander arsenal. After all, they had no idea how many cursed spirits he had, but they could tell bare minimum they did have over 1,000. After all, they did know Geto was capable of picking up 6,000. But Kenjaku decided he might as well give them that little bit of information, as he told them that he had over 1,000,000 cursed spirits. As that made all of their eyes widen in that moment. Sure, they were prepared to deal with a couple thousand curses, but at least 1,000,000? That was something completely insane. It was honestly a number of curses that none of them could really conceptualize in their head. Little did they know, Kenjaku had over 10 million curses within his arsenal. As Yuji then lifted up both of his hands, creating 2 Slicing Exorcisms that had a steam coming off of them, replicating the move that Sukuna had used earlier as he threw one of them towards the Bear Cursed Spirit while throwing another one of them towards the Serpent. And the disc was able to take out the Bear Cursed Spirit, killing it in one shot. However, as it was sent flying towards the Serpent, something else wrapped around the Serpent's body, making it have a much more metallic-like skin. As Kenjaku then explained that this cursed spirit's technique was steel skin, allowing it to harden its body heavily and surround it and coat it in a layer of steel in order to amplify its durability, and through that he used the revealing one's hand binding vow, resulting in its durability being amped even further and it being able to survive against that attack. While it did slice a little bit into the steel skin, it didn't end up fully destroying it. It was going to take a lot more than that, as Yuji was thinking on a way on how to beat it before realizing that more than likely the inside was a lot less durable than the outside due to it mainly being steel skin around its body. But then he saw the Electric Eel Cursed Spirit land on top of the Serpent, realizing the Electric Eel Cursed Spirit was likely going to send constant lightning waves through the Serpent Cursed Spirit's body, using it as a conductor to attempt to land lightning on Yuji's body. And while Kenjaku was watching all of this, he began to speak. You see, this is why I find Cursed Spirits to be so interesting. They can vary in such shapes and forms. Fear can cause them to spawn. Negative emotions of something can cause them to spawn. Whether it's hatred from another individual, fear from something that will never exist, or a completely rational fear, it can end up causing such a variety of cursed spirits and by extension abilities to utilize. Todo and Nobara were handling these wave of cursed spirit moths quite well. After all, none of them were actually quite strong. They were all around a grade 2 to grade 3 level. Furthermore, they were also able to tell which one was going to attack them, As for them to be able to even do some damage, Kenjaku did have to put a little bit more curse energy into them in order to give them that buff. However, Kenjaku was always going to win when it came to a war of attrition, thanks to how much he had in his arsenal, especially after revealing that he had over 1,000,000. As Choso activated Piercing Blood, slicing through several of the humanoid curse spirits that were around them. Even though the Rusted Knight was able to jump over it, the other humanoid curse spirits weren't so lucky, as they ended up being cut in half and dying. As Choso was about to try and put his hands on the ground again, he knew he needed to clear everything out, and he would be one of the better people to do so, considering how many blood arrows he could produce. Yuji would also be in a good position to do so, but Choso right now had an opening and a chance, so he was about to try. The key word being about to, as suddenly a large amount of tree bark rose out underneath Choso and launched him backwards, as a curse spirit completely made out of wood rose out in front of Choso that looked to be humanoid in form. While this curse spirit did most certainly resemble Hanami, it wasn't anywhere near as powerful or as potent as Hanami due to it being made from a lesser amount of negative emotions, as it was only made from a forest where negative emotions had ended up dwelling, in comparison to Hanami, who was the general fear of Mother Nature as a whole. However, they did have a similar curse technique to Hanami, which did allow them to create large amounts of trees. It wasn't similar in a lot of the properties that Hanami had, but it was able to do that nonetheless. It would have been classified as a grade 1 curse normally, however Kenjaku was amplifying it even further with his own curse energy. As Choso focused the blood around his hands, using blood armor once more in preparation to battle against the two cursed spirits, as the Rusted Knight curse spirit rushed towards Choso to continue on its close range battle. Meanwhile, Yuji was rushing towards the large serpent at the same time he was rushing towards him, but Yuji then activated his blood wings as he flew high above the blood serpent and clapped his hands together, firing out a piercing blood and going right through the electric eel, killing it in one shot as he began to fly high up into the air. As Yuji was remembering the tactic that Sukuna had pulled inside of his body, the ability to create so many blood arrows and have them fire down from the heavens, and he was going to do that himself in order to help clear out the area and give his friends a little bit more of a chance. However, suddenly as Yuji was trying to do this move, he was slammed back into the ground, as Yuji was just narrowly able to block two massive hands coming towards him, as Kenjaku would release a rather massive curse spirit, one that would tower even over the size of Jujutsu High. As Kenjaku then deactivated that curse spirit and said, "You do know I watched all of the fights, right? I know what you're going to pull." As Kenjaku looked back to Nobara and Todo in order to see how they were doing, and they could see they were moving through the swarm of cursed spirits. Some progress was being made, but it was rather slow. So Kenjaku decided that he was going to split them up a little bit more, as he summoned up another cursed spirit. This cursed spirit was one that was completely made out of ice, as it rushed towards Nobara, with the ground freezing underneath it with each step, as it then punched the ground, sending a wave of ice spikes towards Nobara's direction, as Nobara was quick to move out of the way, before it then lifted up both of its hands, beginning to rapid-fire bullets of ice towards Nobara, leaving Todo to deal with the swarm of cursed spirit moths. As the serpent attempted to take advantage of the fact that Yuji was now on the ground, attempting to consume Yuji. However, as it attempted that, Yuji clapped his hands together and fired out a piercing blood, firing it right through his body and killing the serpent cursed spirit. However, Yuji was starting to feel it now. His exhaustion was starting to set in. All the while, he could see that Kenjaku was starting to manifest even more cursed spirits. This was a war of attrition that they couldn't win. They needed to find a way to win, but this was not something that they could do. And Choso, Nobara, as well as Todo were all in a similar boat. They were all currently on the defensive right now. While Choso and Todo were the best stamina-wise right now, even they were starting to feel the drain on it. As Kenjaku then was about to increase the number of cursed spirits rushing towards all of them, until suddenly, tens of normal arrows began to come down from the sky and land on each of the cursed spirits. While several of the stronger cursed spirits didn't die from this and get injured, they ended up returning back to Kenjaku, but most of the weaker cursed spirits, including the ones that were swarming around Todo, were now dead. The Frost Giant cursed spirit, the Tree cursed spirit, as well as the Rusted Knight were still all alive. However, Choso did take advantage of this chance to finish off that Rusted Knight cursed spirit with a piercing blood, as Kenjaku couldn't help but smirk a bit, noticing now that the backup had arrived, as Yuji and Todo both recognized who that arrow was from. That was from Kamo Noritoshi. At the same time, a wave of water was launched down towards Kenjaku, as Megumi had arrived, now fully healed and using Max Elephant as well as Nue to send a wave of water and electricity towards them. This massive wave was going to make it much harder to dodge, as Kenjaku did end up unsummoning the two cursed spirits that he had still left, as he summoned his own bird in order to fly out the way, but that bird was shot through the head by Mai Zenin. At the same time, Yuji also offered his own support by firing out a piercing blood at its head. The combination of those two attacks ended up piercing right through the bird and killing it, as Kenjaku was sent towards the ground. Before Kenjaku then felt a simple domain activate behind him from Miwa, as Miwa had casted a binding vow in order to make this the strongest simple domain she could ever muster. In exchange, she would never be able to use a sword again. But a wide smile rose on Kenjaku, as he realized the time had come. The prison realm was now finished. as Kenjaku stopped that attack by catching it with his hand, completely breaking Miwa's sword, before he decided to in turn respond with an Uzumaki. Both using it as an attack against Miwa, but also to extract Mahito's curse technique so he could utilize it to begin the Culling Games. Kusakabe was just narrowly able to save Miwa and move her out of the way from the attack, moving them back towards the group as Panda, Utsuhime, as well as Momo all arrived. Yuji was starting to feel a little bit more confident. Of course, he did know what they were up against, but now there were a lot more of them, as he did warn them in advance that Kenjaku had over 1 million cursed spirits. With them also explaining that this person was not Suguru Geto, but actually Noritoshi Kamo. Not the Noritoshi Kamo that they knew, but the Noritoshi Kamo known as the evilest sorcerer of all time. However, it was then someone with white and red hair arrived. That appeared to be a rather short monk, as they looked towards Kenjaku with a slightly annoyed face, as they questioned, "Why haven't you killed them yet?" With Kenjaku giving a shrug, as he said, "I was intrigued to see how far they would go. Plus, I wasn't really intending to kill any of them. After all, I was going to need a messenger in order to go back to the Jujutsu world." And that just ended up annoying Urame more, as Urame then said, "Itadori Yuji will be enough." As they activated Frost Calm in order to freeze all the sorcerers present. The only ones that were able to avoid it was Momo, Yuji, as well as Megumi, thanks to all of their abilities to fly. Normally Todo would have also been able to avoid it, but he was starting to bottom out in curse energy, and he wouldn't be able to swap yet, as Choso and Kamo began to heat up both of their own blood in order to melt the ice that was around them. And while Urame was about to try and launch out some more ice at the two of them, instead Yuji fired out a piercing blood right at Urame's direction. Now he was even more infuriated about this, as Urame did have to lift up both of their hands in order to block this attack, but it ended up sending them flying backwards and piercing through both of their hands. It did cause quite a bit of damage to Urame, but Urame was still able to heal it off nonetheless, as they looked up to Yuji with an impressed look on them. After all, they could tell that this was Sukuna's vessel, and they had been proved much greater than they were expecting. As Yuji, Choso, Megumi, Kamo, as well as Momo were all preparing to face off against their opponents. Yuji then told Choso to start heating up some of the ice to free some of their allies. After all, Choso was right now the most drained out of them other than Yuji himself. But even in this drained state, Yuji was still stronger than his brother. But Urame had no intention to let that happen, as they activated Ice Fall, attempting to kill everybody here other than Yuji in one fell swoop. But the Ice Fall attack was broken through by another sorcerer who entered onto the field, this sorcerer being Yuki Tsukumo. And seeing a special grade sorcerer arrive like that, it did give them a bit more confidence, as Yuki then told them that Yuji should back him up, while at the same time Kamo should assist with freeing a few more people. Which Kamo did agree with, as he began to free several of the sorcerers from the ice prison, so now was just going to leave Yuki, Megumi, as well as Yuji to face off against the two of them. This also leads into the conversation between Yuki and Kenjaku playing out nearly identical to how it plays out in canon, other than the fact that in the background that Kamo as well as Choso are freeing people, with Yuji acting as a bit of a deterrent for Urame. Mainly because anytime Urame is going to try something, Yuji is prepared to counter against it, until suddenly all the ice melts away as Urame falls down on their knees. This is because of the fact that Yuji's poison had activated inside of Urame. Due to Yuji being part cursed, his blood is poisonous towards sorcerers. On top of that, because of the piercing blood they had blocked, Urame had taken quite a great deal of blood into their system from Yuji. However, that talk was more than enough time, as Kenjaku decided it was now time to activate the Culling Games, as he released his 10 million cursed spirits. Yuji activated Flowing Red Scale Sack, attempting to rush at Kenjaku as fast as possible as he saw the prison realm once more. He was trying to get it, but he wasn't on time. After all, the cursed spirits weren't going to let him get close, as Kenjaku disappeared after activating the Culling Games, taking away Gojo with him. As Yuji began to curse himself, he was feeling so weak for not being able to save Gojo, even though he had done well. Even though he was able to defeat tens of cursed spirits, defeat Jogo, and defeat Mahito, he ultimately ended up falling right into Kenjaku's hands, as he felt like it was because of him that Kenjaku was able to succeed in his plan. As we now turn back to the higher-ups, who the higher-ups are currently discussing the chaotic state of this world. With the release of all of these cursed spirits, as well as the showing of what Sukuna had done and the chaos that Sukuna had caused, there was going to be quite a massive outbreak of chaos in the world. However, it wasn't all bad. After all, while the world was now in a much more chaotic state, Gojo Satoru was now sealed. The person that was a thorn in their side was now sealed away once and for all, as they had released an order for the crimes of Yuji killing thousands of people in Shibuya, as well as Yuji being a death painting. He is to be executed by Yuta Okkotsu. Furthermore, anyone who attempts to free Satoru Gojo is to be executed on sight, as Yuta Okkotsu declares that he will kill Yuji Itadori himself for putting all of his friends' lives in danger. As now the hunt for Yuji Itadori begins, with Yuta Okkotsu being appointed as his executioner. Ultimately, Shibuya was a success for Kenjaku. While there were some things that did certainly go wrong, he did lose some of his allies, it was all negligible. After all, he was able to seal away Gojo, he was able to start the Culling Games with Mahito. He wasn't even sure if he did need to extract Mahito's curse technique, considering how much Mahito did evolve, but it was rather better to be safe than sorry. As he had also gained Jogo and added Jogo to his own arsenal as well, as now he can move on to the next step of his plans, in order to make the golden era of Jujutsu return, and he could already see it was well on the way to returning. Considering how much all of the sorcerers had grown, it was only going to be a matter of time until they returned to such a peak era, and then surpassed it. As Kenjaku couldn't help but be excited to see the path that these new sorcerers were going to take. How were they going to get stronger, and how would they evolve to deal with these circumstances? All of this anticipation and excitement excited him even further, as he hoped that this new generation was not going to disappoint him, and this was not their peaks. But he also knew only time and the Culling Games would truly tell. Especially with the news of Special Grade Sorcerer Yuta Kotsu returning as well, he was also intrigued to see that fight, the battle that would break out between Yuta and Yuji, since he knew it was coming with Yuta being appointed as his executioner. Now up next, I do want to spend some time talking about the sponsor to the channel, Fan Dominion, an old friend of the channel that has a ton of cool anime merch, especially on the JJK side of things, but cool merch overall. And if you're looking for something that looks stylish, something that you can wear out in public and not be called a weeb for, but at the same time be recognized by your friends for wearing something really cool, they have good things in store for you. Or are you looking for something to complete your cosplay with? Well, Fan Dominion has you covered, and don't worry, they aren't expensive at all. And on top of that, if you use my code both in the description as well as on screen now, you can get a 10% discount. Yep, that's right, a 10% discount. However, now I'm going to spend some time showing off their beautiful catalog. And if you like any of this merch and any of this merch looks awesome to you, remember our code EF10 and you'll be able to get a 10% discount. Anyways, I'm going to see y'all later.